The bread you bought this morning isn't what you think it is. It contains ingredients manufacturers don't have to tell you about. Processing enzymes from genetically modified bacteria. Chemical preservatives linked to behavioral problems in children. Industrial emulsifiers damaging your gut bacteria whilst you eat them multiple times daily. You're reading labels carefully, checking for sugar and salt, thinking you're making informed choices. But the most concerning ingredients aren't listed at all. They're completely legal to add without declaring them to you. I'm exposing 10 hidden ingredients poisoning British bread, why they're there, what they're doing to your body, and which breads you can actually trust. Number 10. Dextrose and glucose. You probably assume bread contains no sugar or perhaps a tiny amount to feed the yeast during fermentation. That assumption is completely wrong when it comes to the commercial bread you're buying. Nearly every supermarket loaf you pick up contains added dextrose or glucose. These sugars serve purposes that have nothing to do with traditional bread making and everything to do with industrial speed and profit. Dextrose is a simple sugar derived from corn or wheat starch through industrial processing. Glucose syrup is even more common, showing up in everything from cheap white sliced bread to premium seeded loaves costing £3 or £4. The bread industry claims these sugars help yeast work faster, which is technically true, but that's not the primary reason they add them to nearly every commercial loaf you buy. The real purpose is speeding up the Chorleywood bread process, which is the industrial manufacturing method used to make over 80% of UK bread. Traditional bread making requires several hours of fermentation, during which natural enzymes in flour break down complex starches, develop gluten networks, and create the rich flavours proper bread should have. The Chorleywood process cuts this time down to under 3 hours by using high-speed mixing that violently develops gluten in minutes, extra yeast to force rapid fermentation, and added sugars to feed that yeast and accelerate the entire process beyond anything natural. Adding sugar to bread also improves browning and creates the golden brown crust you expect. Commercial bakeries producing thousands of loaves per hour need consistent appearance across every single loaf, so they use dextrose to guarantee uniform colour regardless of fermentation quality or oven temperature variations. A typical slice of supermarket white bread contains around 1 to 2 grams of sugar, most of which comes from added dextrose. If your children eat 2 slices of toast for breakfast and a sandwich for lunch, they're consuming 4 slices daily, which amounts to 4 to 8 grams of added sugar just from bread. Over a year, that's 1.5 to 3 kilograms of sugar consumed through bread alone. But added sugars are just the beginning. The next ingredient extends shelf life far beyond what real bread should ever achieve. Number 9. Vinegar and acetic acid. Walk into any supermarket and pick up a standard white or wholemeal loaf. You'll almost certainly find vinegar or acetic acid listed somewhere in the ingredients, usually toward the end of the list where you might stop reading. You might assume this adds subtle tanginess or is some kind of traditional baking ingredient. The real purpose is far more commercial. Vinegar is added specifically to extend shelf life and prevent mold growth for as long as possible, allowing bread to survive the modern distribution system you never see. Real bread made with just flour, water, salt, and yeast will begin to go stale within 2 to 3 days and develop visible mold growth within 4 to 5 days if you store it at room temperature. This is completely normal behavior for actual food, but the bread you buy needs to survive transportation from factory to regional distribution, sent to local shop floor to your home, then sit in your home for up to a week or even longer without developing mold or going noticeably stale. Vinegar lowers the pH of bread, creating a slightly acidic environment that inhibits mold and bacterial growth. This allows manufacturers to promise you that their loaves will stay fresh for 7 to 10 days, which sounds convenient, but indicates what you're eating isn't real bread anymore. The bread industry uses the term spirit vinegar or acetic acid rather than preservative because they know you're suspicious of preservatives, but there's nothing traditional about adding vinegar to bread. Traditional bread making relies on proper fermentation and natural acids produced during the process. When manufacturers add vinegar to extend shelf life, they're admitting their bread-making process is so rushed and their fermentation so inadequate that the bread would go moldy within days without chemical intervention. Properly fermented sourdough has naturally lower pH from lactic acid and doesn't need added vinegar. Number 8. Soya flour. Read the ingredient list on almost any commercial loaf you pick up in UK supermarkets, and you'll find soya flour listed. Soya flour is added to between 4 and 5% of the total flour content in most industrial breads, and you probably don't realise you're eating soya every time you eat a sandwich. Soya flour serves multiple purposes in commercial bread production, and none of them improve flavour or nutrition for you. The primary function is improving dough handling properties during high-speed industrial mixing. Soya flour contains natural emulsifiers called lecithins that help dough hold together better under the intense mechanical stress of the Chorley wood process. It also acts as a bleaching agent, making white bread appear even whiter without chemical whitening agents. The enzymes naturally present in soya flour oxidize flour pigments and create the bright white colour you associate with fresh white bread. Soya flour is substantially cheaper than wheat flour, so adding 4 to 5% soya to every loaf reduces production costs. This cost saving might seem small per loaf, but across millions of loaves produced annually, it represents massive profit increases whilst you pay the same price. Soya is one of the most common food allergens. If you have soya allergies, you need to avoid most commercial bread entirely. The bread industry has essentially made soya a hidden ingredient in what should be a simple staple food you can trust. Most soya flour used in UK bread production comes from genetically modified soya beans grown in North and South America. The UK permits GM soya in processed foods, even though you probably prefer to avoid GM ingredients if you're aware they're present. When you buy bread, you assume you're getting wheat flour, water, salt, and yeast. Most of you never read the ingredient list carefully enough to notice the soya flour hiding there. Soya flour is hidden in plain sight, but the next ingredient represents an even more fundamental corruption of what bread should be. Number 7. Palm oil and vegetable fats. Traditional bread contains no added fat beyond the tiny amount naturally present in wheat flour, which is typically less than 2%. But pick up almost any commercial loaf in any UK supermarket, and you'll find palm oil, vegetable oil, rapeseed oil, or the deliberately vague term vegetable fat listed somewhere in the ingredients. These fats serve absolutely no purpose in genuine traditional bread making, but they serve multiple commercial and industrial purposes that prioritize texture manipulation and extended shelf life over actual bread quality you deserve. Adding fat to bread dough creates a softer, more pillowy texture you've been systematically conditioned to prefer through decades of commercial bread marketing. The fat coats gluten strands during mixing and prevents them from forming the strong, interconnected network that gives traditional bread its characteristic, satisfying, chewy texture and substantial bite. The result is bread that feels unnaturally soft in your hand and compresses easily when you squeeze it, collapsing rather than bouncing back the way real bread should. Fat also extends the perceived freshness of bread by significantly slowing down the staling process that occurs naturally in all baked goods. Bread without added fat will begin to firm up and lose its fresh, soft texture within hours of baking, as starch molecules inside the bread begin to recrystallize and release moisture. Added fat interferes with this natural recrystallization process and keeps bread feeling artificially soft for days longer than it naturally would, creating the illusion of freshness when the bread is actually old. Palm oil has become the fat of choice for UK bread manufacturers because it's extraordinarily cheap and remains semi-solid at room temperature. But palm oil production is environmentally catastrophic, driving deforestation across Southeast Asia and destroying orangutan habitats. Every hour, an area of rainforest equivalent to 300 football pitches is cleared for palm oil plantations. The bread industry uses terms like vegetable fat or vegetable oil because these sound healthier to you than industrial fat used to cut production costs. But there's nothing natural about adding fat to bread you're eating daily. Standard everyday bread should contain 0 added fat. When you see palm oil or vegetable fat on an ingredient list, you're looking at evidence the manufacturer prioritizes soft texture and extended shelf life over genuine bread quality. Number 6. Added gluten. Wheat flour naturally contains between 8 and 15% gluten protein, depending on the wheat variety, growing conditions, and how the wheat was milled. This natural gluten protein network is what allows bread dough to stretch and trap gas bubbles during fermentation, creating the risen loaf structure you recognize as proper bread. But commercial UK bread manufacturers aren't satisfied with nature's gluten content, so they routinely add extra gluten that's been extracted from wheat and processed into a highly concentrated powder form you're eating without knowing. Added gluten, usually listed simply as wheat gluten or wheat protein on ingredient labels without any further explanation, serves one primary purpose in industrial bread production. It strengthens dough enough to withstand the violent high-speed mixing used in the Chorleywood process without tearing apart. Traditional bread making involves gentle hand kneading or slow-speed mechanical mixing over extended periods, allowing gluten networks to develop naturally and gradually. The Chorleywood process uses massive industrial mixers that spin at extremely high speeds for just 3 to 4 minutes, creating intense mechanical stress and shear forces that would tear apart normal dough containing only natural gluten. By adding concentrated gluten powder extracted from wheat, manufacturers create an artificially strong and resilient dough network that can survive this industrial violence without falling apart or losing structure. The resulting bread has a tighter, more uniform crumb structure with smaller, more regular holes throughout. While gluten itself isn't dangerous for most of you, the concentrated gluten used in industrial bread is a highly processed protein extract that may behave differently in your digestive system compared to the gluten naturally present in wheat flour. Some gastroenterologists suspect that the sharp rise in reported gluten sensitivity over the past 2 decades may be partially related to increased consumption of added gluten in commercial bread you've been eating for years. The bread industry insists that added gluten is safe because it comes from wheat, but this argument ignores the fundamental difference between eating wheat flour with natural gluten content and eating bread loaded with extracted concentrated gluten powder. Added gluten also changes bread texture in subtle but noticeable ways. Bread made with added gluten tends to be chewier and more elastic than bread made with just natural gluten. This might sound appealing, but it represents another departure from what bread should naturally be. Added gluten strengthens industrial dough unnaturally, but the next category of ingredients represents pure food chemistry with no place in traditional bread. Number 5. Flour treatment agents. Every commercial loaf you buy in UK supermarkets contains what the industry politely calls flour treatment agents, which is jargon for chemicals added to flour to make it behave more predictably during industrial processing. The most common is ascorbic acid, listed as E300, but several others appear regularly in bread you're eating. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C, which sounds harmless until you understand why it's added. In industrial bread making, ascorbic acid acts as an oxidizing agent that strengthens gluten bonds and speeds up dough development. This allows manufacturers to reduce mixing time, reduce fermentation time, and produce bread faster and more cheaply than traditional methods you might remember. Traditional bread making relies on time and natural enzymatic processes to develop gluten structure and flavor. The Chorleywood process uses ascorbic acid as a chemical shortcut to achieve in minutes what would naturally take hours. Other flour treatment agents include L-cysteine, which is derived from duck feathers or human hair and used to soften dough for easier mechanical handling. The bread industry avoids mentioning the source because they know you'd be disturbed by the idea of eating bread containing processed feather or hair proteins. These chemicals exist solely to make industrial bread production faster and cheaper, not to improve bread quality or nutrition for you. They're essentially subsidizing inadequate fermentation and poor bread making technique with chemistry. A skilled baker using proper methods doesn't need ascorbic acid or L-cysteine because time and temperature do the same job naturally without chemicals you wouldn't add at home. The bread industry argues that these additives are safe at the levels used, and regulatory agencies have approved their use. But safety and necessity are different questions. Traditional bread making for thousands of years never involved flour treatment agents. What you can do? Buy bread from traditional bakeries that don't use flour treatment agents, or make your own bread at home. Real bread doesn't need chemical shortcuts. Number 4. Emulsifiers. Open almost any loaf of supermarket bread you've bought and you'll find emulsifiers listed in the ingredients, usually designated by E numbers such as E471 and E472E. These are mono and diglycerides of fatty acids and their derivatives, and they appear in the vast majority of commercial bread you're eating regularly. But you probably don't understand what emulsifiers actually do or why bread supposedly needs them. Emulsifiers are molecules with one end that attracts water and one end that attracts fat. In bread making, emulsifiers serve several industrial purposes that have nothing to do with making better bread for you. The primary function is creating a finer, more uniform crumb structure with smaller air bubbles. This makes bread look more consistent from slice to slice, which commercial bakeries value. Traditional bread has irregular hole sizes, which is perfectly normal and doesn't affect quality. Emulsifiers also improve dough stability during high-speed mechanical mixing and allow manufacturers to use lower quality flour while still producing acceptable bread. When manufacturers add emulsifiers, dough becomes more tolerant of variations in flour quality, mixing speed, and fermentation time. Most importantly for manufacturers, emulsifiers extend the perceived freshness of bread by slowing down the staling process. They interact with starch molecules and prevent them from recrystallizing as quickly as they naturally would. Recent studies have suggested that some emulsifiers may negatively affect your gut bacteria and intestinal health. Research published in Nature found that certain emulsifiers altered the gut microbiome in mice and promoted inflammation and metabolic syndrome. The mice consuming emulsifiers showed increased intestinal permeability, often called leaky gut, which allowed bacteria to enter the bloodstream and trigger inflammatory responses. Human studies are still limited, but the early evidence suggests that consuming emulsifiers daily may have consequences you're only beginning to understand. E471 and E472E are synthesized from fats, often palm oil, through industrial chemical processes. They're not natural ingredients and they serve no nutritional purpose whatsoever for you. What you can do, check ingredient lists for E471, E472E, or any mention of emulsifiers or mono and diglycerides. Buy bread without these additives. Traditional bakeries don't use them. Number 3. Calcium propionate. Turn over almost any packaged sliced bread in a UK supermarket and you'll find calcium propionate, listed as E282. This chemical preservative appears in the vast majority of commercial bread you're buying, and its sole purpose is preventing mold growth and extending shelf life beyond what natural bread would ever achieve. Calcium propionate is a salt of propionic acid, and it works by inhibiting the growth of molds and some bacteria that would normally colonize bread within days of baking. Real bread made with just flour, water, salt, and yeast will develop mold within 4 to 6 days at room temperature. This is completely normal for actual food, but commercial bread, manufacturers need their products to survive a week or more from factory to distribution to shop to your home. So they add calcium propionate to kill or suppress the microorganisms that would naturally grow on bread you're storing. The bread industry defends calcium propionate by pointing out that propionic acid occurs naturally in some cheeses and is produced by bacteria in your gut. This is technically true but deliberately misleading. The concentration of calcium propionate added to bread is far higher than propionic acid naturally present in cheese. Studies have linked calcium propionate consumption to behavioral changes in some children, including irritability, restlessness, and sleep disturbances. A study published in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health found that some children showed significant behavioral improvements when calcium propionate was removed from their diets. The evidence remains debated, and the bread industry vigorously disputes these findings. But parents of children with attention or behavioral issues report anecdotal improvements when switching to preservative-free bread, though establishing causation is difficult. More broadly, regularly consuming mold inhibitors may have subtle effects on your gut bacteria that you don't yet fully understand. Your digestive system contains trillions of bacteria that play crucial roles in digestion, immune function, and overall health. The truly disturbing aspect of calcium propionate is what it reveals about industrial food production priorities. Rather than making bread fresh daily and expecting you to eat it quickly, manufacturers add chemical preservatives so bread can sit on shelves for a week or more. What you can do: look for bread without calcium propionate or E282. Buy from bakeries making fresh bread daily, or freeze bread immediately after buying to preserve freshness without chemical preservatives. Number 2. Mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. Mono and diglycerides of fatty acids appear in most commercial UK bread ingredient lists you're reading, often without any E number designation. These emulsifiers are synthesized from fats through industrial processes, and they have an additional problem the bread industry desperately wants you to ignore. They may contain trans fats. Trans fats are unsaturated fats with a specific molecular structure that makes them solid at room temperature and extremely harmful to your health. They raise bad cholesterol, lower good cholesterol, promote inflammation, and significantly increase your risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. The evidence against trans fats is so overwhelming that many countries have banned them entirely to protect public health. The problem with mono and diglycerides is how they're manufactured. These emulsifiers are created by chemically breaking down and recombining fats, often through a process that can create trans fats as byproducts. UK regulations don't require manufacturers to test or declare trans fat content in mono and diglycerides. This means you have no way of knowing whether your daily bread contains these dangerous fats you've been told to avoid. Studies have shown that commercial mono and diglycerides can contain anywhere from 0 to 40% trans fats, depending on the manufacturing process and source fats used. A loaf-listing mono and diglycerides might contain negligible trans fats, or it might contain substantial amounts. You have absolutely no way to tell which you're eating. The bread industry responds to concerns by claiming that amounts are small and therefore insignificant. But this argument ignores cumulative exposure. If you eat 2 to 3 slices of commercial bread daily for decades, those small amounts accumulate into substantial lifetime consumption, affecting your heart health. Mono and diglycerides are completely unnecessary in bread. They exist purely to make industrial production more convenient. Traditional bread making has never required emulsifiers of any kind. The regulatory system has failed you on this issue. Mono and diglycerides should require full disclosure of trans fat content so you can make informed choices. What you can do: avoid bread listing mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. Buy bread from traditional bakeries using only flour, water, salt, and yeast. Protect your heart health by eliminating hidden trans fats. Mono and diglycerides hide potential trans fats, but the number one hidden ingredient is even more deceptive because it does not appear on labels at all. Number 1. Processing enzymes. This is the number one hidden ingredient that reveals the deepest and most systematic deception in the UK bread industry, affecting you daily. Processing enzymes are routinely added to almost every single commercial loaf of bread sold in British supermarkets, yet they don't appear on ingredient lists at all anywhere. You could read every word on the label and never know they're there. This is completely legal under current UK and EU food labelling regulations because enzymes are classified as processing aids rather than ingredients, creating a massive loophole that allows manufacturers to use them extensively without ever declaring them to you. Processing enzymes are biological catalysts derived from bacteria, fungi, or genetically modified microorganisms, and they're added to bread dough in specific quantities to speed up fermentation times, improve dough handling properties, and extend shelf life beyond what traditional methods would achieve. The most common enzymes include alpha amylase, which breaks down starch molecules into simple sugars for faster yeast activity and fermentation, and xylanase, which modifies flour proteins for easier mechanical handling during high-speed industrial processing. These enzymes allow bread manufacturers to cut fermentation time dramatically, reducing what should naturally be a 4 to 6 hour fermentation process down to under 2 hours or even less in some industrial operations. This time reduction translates directly into increased profit because factories can produce substantially more loaves per day using the same equipment, the same factory space, and the same workforce. Here's the critical deception. Bread manufacturers use these enzymes extensively throughout the production process, yet you, reading ingredient label, have absolutely no idea they exist. You could compare labels from 10 different bread brands and never see any mention of enzymes because regulations don't require disclosure. Walk into any supermarket right now, pick up 5 different loaves, and read every word on every label. You won't find a single mention of alpha amylase, xylanase, or any other processing enzyme, despite the fact that these chemicals were absolutely used in production of the bread you're buying. The justification for this regulatory loophole is that enzymes are supposedly deactivated during baking and therefore don't remain active in the finished bread you eat, but this reasoning is questionable. First, enzyme deactivation is never complete, and residual enzyme activity can continue in bread after baking. Second, even if enzymes are fully deactivated, their presence during dough preparation fundamentally changes the bread structure you're eating. More concerning are enzymes derived from genetically modified organisms. Many processing enzymes used in UK bread production come from GM bacteria or fungi engineered to produce specific enzymes in high quantities. If you carefully avoid GM foods, you'd be shocked to learn that your supposedly GM-free bread was made using enzymes from genetically modified organisms the industry never told you about. Some enzymes used in bread making have been linked to occupational allergies in bakery workers who inhale enzyme dust during production. Alpha amylase in particular is known to cause bakers' asthma in industrial settings. The fundamental issue is transparency and your informed consent. You buying bread have the right to know exactly what's been added to your food, whether classified as ingredients or processing aids. If you bake bread at home using just flour, water, salt, and yeast, you use 0 processing enzymes because none are necessary. The fact that industrial bread requires multiple enzymes reveals how far removed commercial bread has become from real bread you should be eating. What you can do: buy bread from traditional bakeries that don't use processing enzymes, or make your own bread at home. Ask bakeries directly whether they use enzymes. Support transparency in food labeling by choosing real bread. So there you have it. 10 hidden ingredients in British bread, many of which don't even appear on labels you're reading. Which hidden ingredient shocked you most? Are you checking your bread labels after watching this? Share this with anyone still buying industrial bread without realizing what they're actually eating. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation.